All right, so, all right. Do I need to hit continue? Yeah, I guess I do. All right. All right, there we go. I'm learning all this technology. I'm going to Maui on Sunday with my family, and my son-in-law works at Google. So he's going to be there to guide me through a couple of programs I have to do while I'm over there. It's going to be interesting.
Okay. And then Laura, are you going to go dark?
I'll stay live.
Okay.
All right. So Brandon, just a reminder, I'm going to start with you, and then we're going to go to Molly, and then we're going to go to Matt, if that's okay. Does anybody have a problem with me using first names? I mean, I'm happy to use, more formal name, but okay, good.
As long as it's the one that WITSEC has assigned me, that's fine.
Okay.
Question.
So I guess the Supreme Court ruled in favor of that cheerleader, huh? 8-1.
So we can start in about 1 minute.
Okay.
We have 92 in, so 93. They're coming in.
Yeah, we're up over 100 already. Which, to be honest, is what I thought we would have when we first decided to do this program. I'm really, really happy about, at least people registered, whether they'll show up. A lot of them will watch the recording. That seems to be the way things go. I know we had that live rant that Lori and I did, and, we ended up with 2,000 people watching it. So you never know how many people are going to watch the show. The staff here, I do a program once every couple of weeks on a hot topic. And the staff actually named the program John's Rants. So I guess that, Brandon, you and I have done enough programs together to know why they call me that. But I'm going to be a good boy today, I promise.
That's a popular series.
Yeah, no, I'm so thankful y'all putting this on and inviting us. I think it's a real important conversation. It's great to have a place to have
Honestly,
this.
I think that, a program like what Molly teaches up at McGeorge, I can't, the more I listen to the nonsense I listen to on the news and watch our so-called leaders, and the more I realize the burden or the obstacle that everybody has to really just do the right thing. And it just, I think a full program would be very, very helpful. One of these days, I've proposed to these are two pretty big boards. I think between the two of you, you're at what, 16,000 members, something like that between
Something
the two
like
of
that. Yeah.
you. Yeah. And so, something where there's more of a, Molly understood the concept of scope and sequence. We tend to teach realtors the same thing, whether they're at Matt's level or whether they're at, a brand new realtor. And California Association is coming out with a brand new contract in December. And I've been working with 4 or 5 brokers trying to figure out how to teach it to the different levels, because you got people that they don't even know the contract's going to change because they've really never read the one we're using right now. And then you've got people like Matt that, know that thing backward, know the contracts backwards and forwards. So
Okay, we're ready to start.
It'll be interesting over the next couple of years. All right, is it,
We're ready to start, John.
I'm sorry?
We're ready to start.
Okay, you want to, are they coming in? I mean, are people lined up? I mean, I don't know how that all works, but, all right. I mean, I'm happy to get started.
There's 155 here. There's 155 enjoying our pre-show.
Everybody knows, because I do a lot of training at all the different associations, I do a lot of risk management because I used to be a trial lawyer, and they know my level of technological knowledge is somewhat limited. This is my normal PowerPoint right here. So, all right, well, we're going to get started then. So good morning, everybody. First of all, welcome to the Fair Housing Symposium. I'm very, very excited to act as the moderator today. I'm John Giardinelli, and I'm the association's counsel. When the staff decided to put this program on, and we decided to do it as a panel, I was asked to make some recommendations, and the 3 people that you see on the screen were my 3 choices. I am very, very excited to have all 3 of them on today, and I'll introduce them individually in a second. Our goal here is really fairly simple. This is a very broad topic, a very hot button topic, lots of political issues, lots of media attention, lots of political attention. But we're here today as realtors trying to make sure that you understand what your obligations are and how to better serve your buyers, your sellers, your landlords, and your tenants. And so, and secondly, and frankly, in my view, just as importantly, to just raise the bar in the industry. Realtors, I've been incredibly proud to represent you for a very long time. Most of you do an incredible job at a very high level, and it's time that we raise the bar. We're going to give you some tips and talk about things like your advertising. We're going to talk about issues regarding steering, a topic that I first learned about a couple of years ago, attending a program that Professor Molly put on about implied bias and how to recognize some of the things inside yourself that maybe you need to think about. And then we're going to try and give you some best practices and hopefully end up with some good resources. After this program is over, I'm going to prepare a brief report, and we're going to put Laura and Lori and I are going to put together a bibliography of some of the resources, post them on the association's website, and you're all going to be given as much information as you care to read. Our panelists are amazing. We have a broad range of representation from academia, from government, and from private practice. So let me just tell you a little bit about our 3 panelists. Brandon Butler, who is a good friend of organized real estate. He's been on a number of panels here at the association and elsewhere. He's always willing to help, answer questions. He is the Assistant Deputy Director of Education and Outreach for the California Department of Fair Housing and Employment. Prior to that, he worked for Legal Aid down in San Diego. He's knowledgeable, he's reasonable, and he's fair. And I've come to really rely on him as a contact for information. I hate to use the word life-changing, but a couple of years I attended a program that the California Association of Realtors put on, and we had this professor, and I thought, oh gosh, why do I want to go to this luncheon? Who cares about implied bias? I don't even know what that is. And I listened to her talk, and it really was an amazing change in my personal attitude about things, and got me curious about a lot of about the topic. And so Professor Molly Stafford is a professor and the assistant dean of career development at one of the best law schools in California, McGeorge School of Law. And prior to her teaching and assistant deanship, she was with the rural CRLA Rural Fair Housing Center, and has a broad range of experience. And she's going to talk to us today about implied bias and the things to look for within yourself. And then we're going to certainly, last but not least, is Matt DeFanis. Matt is someone I've heard on a number of occasions now, and always does a great job. Matt is the broker and owner of Remax Realty and Associates in Champaign, Illinois. You can tell by the shirt that he's wearing today. Matt is the 2021 chair of the Professional Standards Interpretations and Advisory Procedures Advisory Board. He was the chair of the NAR Professional Standards Committee, and has served as the president of the Illinois Realtors. So we have a really top-notch panel for you. What we're going to do is we're going to put Brandon on first to set the foundation for what's going on in the state, go to Molly, and then finish up with Matt. We're going to welcome your questions. Please put them in the Q&A. I think that's where the ladies, you want them to go. If we have time, which I don't know that we will, we can answer questions afterwards, but we're going to take questions after each presentation. Each panelist is invited to comment as well, and we'll be here for 2 hours. So without further ado, Brandon Butler, you are on, sir.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Let me go ahead and just get my screen up here. Let me first say thank you to John and Lori and Laura and the entire Pacific West Association of Realtors and the Tri-County Realtor Association for putting this on. It's great to be here, and it's wonderful to have a space to really talk about fair housing issues. And also, let me say how what an honor it is to present with Professor Stafford and as well as Matt in this important conversation today. So thanks again. So you heard about me, yes, fair housing attorney, and prior to DFEH, and I really like talking about fair housing issues. So let's jump into it. I really just want to set the stage for what we're going to hear later today, and kind of build a little foundation, and also give you a few points and issues that are relevant to what we see at DFEH. But first, let me say this is for informational purposes only. Not anything I'm talking about that is not established substantive policy or rights and does not constitute legal advice. Yeah, you got to give our disclaimer. And most folks know us here today, but just in case you don't know, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing is California's civil rights agency. It's the mission of DFEH to protect the people of California from unlawful discrimination in employment, which we do a lot, as well as in housing, businesses, which include most housing accommodations, from the perpetration of acts of hate, violence, and human trafficking. So we have that broad mission, and we work for you. We're your civil rights agency. But I wanted just to get right into it. So when we think about fair housing and kind of why are we here? I always like to start with that. Why are we having this discussion? Why is it such an important discussion? And just as just a picture to show you, this is just one of many that were developed around the 1930s in the United States. This is one of the homeowners loan corporation maps, which really it created a foundation of redlining and segregating communities, right? Because after the Great Depression, the homeowners loan corporation, which was like a quasi-governmental body, went around, and all this, has used race as a factor to determine whether a property should receive insurance, an investment, et cetera, or whether it shouldn't. And the map you're looking at is the city of San Diego, where I live. And, I like to show this map because in many of the red areas, these are where people of color live then, and they live today. And why is that important? Because it tells us, when we think about steering and where people live, that we're coming to a world of fair housing where we have a long history, where the status quo was to restrict property based on race, right? Many of the green properties were restricted by racial covenants. You had to be Caucasian to live there. And those areas today are still predominantly Caucasian. And so when we think of this conundrum of intentional discrimination, implicit bias, a lot of this comes from this long past. And of course, it goes back before this. But just even in modern time, we kind of created a system of segregating people on the basis of race, and it was acceptable and it was allowed. So when we think about why there's such an issue here today, we're building on the past, right? So I think that's what's key about this. And then just to note some of the comments that were put with the map. In the green area is one example, just to show you where we were as a country in the 1930s. It said, and it was rating the property as a green, a place to invest. Canyons considered very desirable for home site, residents white, with a few of the upper class Spanish families consisting of naval officers, business and professional men and retired people. No ratio of concentration, no threat of infiltration, restricted to the Caucasian race. And then we look at one of the areas that was yellow, which was declining, and again, race was a factor. And the comment for that section of the map said, this area lies along the bay and is a desirable district. However, in this area is located the servants' quarters of the colored population of Coronado. There's considerable building going on at this time, and were it not for the colored population and a dump at the northeast portion of the area, the same would be classified as a blue area and comparable to B13. It's absolutely desirable, with the exception of the facts set out above, and it is necessary for this exclusive city to have such an area. In all other respects, it compares favorably. And I think what's so interesting about these comments, and it may be very stark if you've never heard this before, but it really goes to our discussion today. The inequity, the implicit bias, both unconscious, conscious, that was built up on this past, that this was where we were in terms of segregating people and the likes. And then I just fast forward, so that was the 30s. I fast forward to kind of the 60s, and you're looking at a picture of a protest related to Prop 14. And for folks who've been around, that Prop 14 was a proposition that would have allowed did allow private discrimination in the rental market. And the sales market, and all in the private rental market, period. There could be discrimination on any basis. And this proposition passed on a 2-to-1 margin, wasn't even close. And in this picture you're seeing, which was at the Los Angeles Library, you see a group in the front holding signs saying, abolish the Rumford Forced Housing Act, which was our fair housing law that was repealed. And you see a big group of folks saying, no, let's keep it. But again, I raised this, and again, the long story, if you don't know, is the case went to the Supreme Court. Essentially, it was invalidated, violating our Equal Protection Clause, and we were able to keep our fair housing laws in California. But it did pass, and the people of California wanted to allow private discrimination in the housing market. So I bring this up again when we talk about implicit bias. How do we get here? We're building on these foundational blocks of there's been a deep concern and an issue around discrimination, both intentional and legalized, as well as to where we went throughout the decades, still having continued problems. So that just kind of brings us here to kind of set the basis of where are we kind of right now and what are some of the issues. So we have the Fair Employment and Housing Act in California, right? This is our primary fair housing law, and it protects people of California from unlawful discrimination on these bases. So just so we're all on the same page, you cannot treat anyone differently in a housing transaction, sales, rental, insurance, lending, down the line, on the basis of their race, right? Race is black, white, Asian. It's a broad category of what race is, and it also includes hairstyle and hair textures. Like cornrows and braids and dreadlocks, right? So if anyone was being treated differently on that basis, that would be considered racial discrimination. We have color, right? How dark or how light or skin tone, ancestry, similar to national origin, where you're from. Religion, whether you have a religion or do not, cannot be treated differently, right? If someone's Muslim, we can't, if they're treated differently in a housing transaction, that's unlawful. Sex and gender, as well as sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression are all protected. National origin, again, country of origin, source of income, we've talked about this in the past, but this is literally, you can't treat anyone differently on the basis of their lawful source of income, which now includes a Section 8 voucher and other forms of rental assistance, especially as we talk about this COVID crisis that is luckily coming to an end here in California. There are now lots of new forms of vouchers and things that are now protected source of income can't treat people differently. Marital status, whether you're married or not, you're a single mom, you can't be treated differently. And then, of course, familial status, presence of children in the house under the age of 18 or pregnant or securing custody of a child. And then disability, medical condition, veteran status. And then also highlight primary language, immigration status, and citizenship status, along with age, are all protected. So, I mean, there's a lot to know for a realtor in California, but it's important to understand that these are the bases. So, you know, even saying I prefer not to work with someone, you know, who speaks Spanish, or that's their primary language. I don't want to represent them. When we're getting into primary language discrimination, right? So there's a lot of contours as you think about this, how this could be relevant to your work. Okay, so I just want to cover that, and more than happy to provide these slides to the association to provide. And then just want to show you, are we still dealing with fair housing issues? Yes. In 2019, which is the last year of publicly released data, we had 934 complaints filed with our office. And I'll tell you, in 2020, the number has gone up, a dramatic increase. And so we're seeing more complaints year after year, more fair housing complaints are filed with our office. So again, this isn't stuff we're talking about long ago in the 1930s, the 1960s. This is right here, right now. The numbers are going up. Now, whether that's from increased awareness of civil rights laws, or there's more discrimination, there's a lot of things to understand, but we know the numbers are going up. So it tells us it's critical to understand fair housing laws. And you'll note that race was the number 2 category of discrimination, disability being number 1, but race is right up there. You see we had 538 disability and 179 race complaints. So I want to just move through this because I want to cover a couple other points. So if you're a realtor out there and you're looking for, like, where's the actual law, I want to read more, you should go to our website and read about the regulations that define our Fair Employment and Housing Act. They're relatively new, which is why I raise it up as a point. They were released in 2020, and this is the first time in California history that we have regulations that go through each subject. And you'll note there's certain articles are missing here because we're adding more. There's going to be more regulations coming to help define areas, including discriminatory statements is going through a review of regulations right now that you would find interesting. So we have regulations now that accompany the government code, which is, you know, the actual fair housing law. But I would encourage folks to take a look at it, and you can find it on our website. I'll provide you this information as well. But one of the things I think is important to our conversation today and around implicit bias and around just, you know, racial discrimination in general is to understand the theories of liability in fair housing. What are those theories? How am I liable for violating the Fair Housing Act? We often think about intentional discrimination, but I think when I'm going to talk about buyer love letters, but to get there, I think we have to talk about discriminatory effect. What's that? It's a legal theory and it's codified in our regulations, which basically says there's some policy on the part of the housing provider that's creating a disparate impact on a group of individuals who are protected on their protected class, race, religion, gender, or it somehow is creating or increasing or reinforcing or perpetuating segregated housing patterns based on membership in a protected class. So I think this is important for realtors to get, because this does not mean that you have any intent to discriminate. You just had a policy that said, you know, every buyer or every, you know, potential buyer has to send the seller a letter and a picture of the family. It's just the policy we have. I use that as an example, but these are things that may not have been done with an intent, but you need to view these issues through the lens of, okay, maybe there was no intent, but did it have a distinct impact on a group of people? Did this policy result in Black people not getting a house, or getting it, or devaluing the home price on an appraisal? What was it? If it possibly, maybe it was intent, maybe it was both. But if you are having a policy that does have a distinct impact on a group of people, the only way that it can essentially survive a fair housing challenge for having this discriminatory effect is if you have a legally sufficient justification, business reason that can meet the elements. And again, you know, is this practice of the housing provider necessary to achieve one or more substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory business interests? I mean, if we look at buyer love letters and pictures, I don't know. And I'm not taking a position one way or the other, but this is the framework for thinking about it. You know, does the practice effectively carry out the identified business interest? Well, I thought the interest was we want to get the highest price for the house. we want to make much income. Isn't that our business interest? Well, what's the relevancy of pictures and things about family, right? Shouldn't the property go to the highest bidder? So one has to wonder, do those even carry out the business interest? And is there any feasible alternative practice that would equally or better accomplish the identified business interest with less discriminatory effect? And so these are some of the factors that a court would look at if there was a challenge to a policy or a practice of a realtor or a brokerage house, whatever, that was having this impact. Doesn't mean every time there's a violation, but it means that it has to go through these elements to essentially challenge it. And that kind of brings us to these buyer letters, these love letters. And we've talked about this, but I really think it's a fascinating subject. But I like to start with this statement from the National Association of Realtors, who really taken a position on this. And from their website, they define buyer love letters in fair housing as kind of a tactic used by some buyers in an attempt to stand out to a seller, especially in hot markets with low inventory and bidding wars. Seemingly harmless, these letters actually raise fair housing concerns and could open real estate professionals and their clients to fair housing violations. And they go on to say, to entice the seller to choose their offer, buyers sometimes write love letters to describe the many reasons why the seller should pick them. While this may seem harmless, these letters can actually pose fair housing risks because they often contain personal information and reveal characteristics of the buyer, such as race, religion, or familial status, which would then be used as knowingly or through unconscious bias, which we'll hear more about later, as an unlawful basis for a seller's decision to accept or reject an offer. Right. So I use this, and that's why I was talking about discriminatory effect, because you start looking at these things and you say, oh, it's just harmless. We're just, they're telling about Sally and the kids. But it just so happens the Black family's never getting the property on these buyer love letters, or less often. Doesn't mean that there was an intent to discriminate, but I think you need to view your practices through this other lens of liability, that there may be no intent, but it's having an effect. And is there a lesser discriminatory way to do it? And I also just bring out too and maybe Molly will hit on this, but as a musician and someone who played in orchestras and things, you always knew about the studies that were done when predominantly in orchestras, they were predominantly men who played in all the top metropolitan orchestras, and despite there being many women extremely talented musicians, they were never picked on these auditions. Well, they orchestras adopted screened auditions, where they literally took a screen. The folks who were doing the auditions could not see who the musician was, and they would even tell the musician to take their shoes off, so they wouldn't hear any clacking of any heels or anything like that. You could not tell who the race was, what the gender was. And when that happened, we saw an increase in women of being in the top metropolitan orchestras the minute the screening went on, and that's increased throughout the years. And I just bring that up when you think about buyer love letters. And we know about, and I'm sure there's plenty of other research, but the correlation, whether through unconscious bias or not, that you have people with the same exact kind of criteria, but they're not being picked. And that brings up this issue of unconscious bias. It brings up other issues. But here we have kind of an example, not in the housing market, but one showing how the mind does think. And when we don't know who the identity is of perhaps the home buyer or the home seller, perhaps that's a less discriminatory way to go about our business practice. Now, let me just mention intentional discrimination quickly as well. So with intentional discrimination, it's different than discriminatory effects. This is actually where there's intent. Someone treated someone differently because of who they are intentionally, right? And in the housing transaction, we're talking about discrimination in rental, sales, insurance, lending, appraisal. And some of the examples are steering people to certain neighborhoods on the basis of their race. We'll talk about the lowballing appraisal. I want to show you a little video on that. And blockbusting, which we don't see as much anymore, which is essentially, busting up the block, telling people to move out because people of another race were going to move in for a profit. We don't see as much of that. But one of the things I just find it so important for the realtor market to really get was the Long Island divided study by Newsday. I'm not going to show you the video. You may have seen it before, but essentially what it told us is that in a 2-year-long investigation of doing fair housing testing in Long Island, on the basis of race, where they tested real estate offices and realtors, they found really high disparate treatment for the black testers. You know, almost 49% of the time there was a difference. They were treated differently compared to 39% for Hispanic and 19 for Asian testers. And one of the things when we talk about best practices that time and time again is shown in this video is that the primary problem of the realtor was they were giving different information to the home buyers who had the same exact qualifications on the basis of their race. You know, and some examples here, you know, would be, you know, telling a white prospective home buyer who, you know, for instance, like you see here saying, follow the school bus, see the moms that are hanging out on the corners. You know, this is told to a white prospective home buyer by the brokerage office. Same, a black prospective home buyer wants to live in the same area. They're not told about that, right? You know, they're given different information. They're told the exact opposite. You know, you'd like to live here, right? We're treating people differently. Why was the same information not given when they both wanted to live in the same area? Another example from the video you know, I like is there again, tell the white prospective home buyer, talk about the property. Some of them are not as nice. Elkmont, most of Hampstead, Roosevelt, Baldwin, Freeport, you know, maybe not as nice in terms of statistics. Wasn't said to the protected testers. And then, you know, you have another one where he tells the white prospective home buyer in East Hampton, the Hispanic community came in and they really took over Springs. Not told to others. So again, you're not only getting discriminatory statements and things like this, but the idea of best practices, and it's stated throughout this video, is you treat people the same. If they want to live in a neighborhood, that's where you show them properties. We don't use our either conscious or unconscious bias to steer people to certain neighborhoods on the basis of race. And Omali will talk about this, but I think this is a monumental study because it's right there on video, seeing how it happens. Even if there isn't the intent, we're seeing unconscious bias come through. So, I mean, I think a key takeaway for everyone here today is we show people the properties that they've asked for. We treat everyone the same. We don't steer them or think they'll like to live in a neighborhood that's you know, more of their race. And some of the other tests that they did that were interesting is, you know, in one of the tests, an agent suggests 5 plain view homes to a white house hunter, but tells a black home buyer that houses with the same market value there are out of his price range, even though they have the same income. Another test shows an agent takes a white customer on house tours without requesting identification, but asks a black house hunter to show ID. And that's just differential treatment, right? Another test showed an agent warns a white home buyer about gang violence in Brentwood, but directs the black house hunter toward the predominantly minority community. Doesn't say anything about it, right? Different information. Another test, an agent warns a white customer to avoid investing in Freeport, but suggests a predominantly minority village could be a good choice for a black customer, right? So whether this is intentional discrimination, which it may be, or whether it's unconscious bias, it's showing you what the problem is. The same information needs to be given to the same home buyers, regardless of their race. And that's a real, you know, important thing. And I'll let, I know Maya have a lot to say there. But I also wanted to talk about something that's really been hot lately. And actually over the last week, there's been a lot more coming out about what's going on with appraisals and discrimination on race. There was this story that using a picture of a family in New York, or back east, was in the New York Times, where there was a dramatic devaluation of their home when they had it appraised, and when they did a second appraisal and took away any picture of the wife and her family who were black, the home appraised much higher. And there was a story in Indiana last month about $150,000 change. And then I want to show you just a quick video that just a couple minutes long that is from the Bay Area from earlier this year about a couple in Marin who faced a real dramatic appraisal situation on the basis of race. And I just want to show it to you to kind of just give you a sense of what's happening and some of the issues that are really rising up. And before I say that, let me also say that President Biden and HUD are issuing a new initiative to work on appraisal discrimination, seeing it as one of the issues creating to a higher or lack of wealth among people of color because of the devaluation of home prices. And so there's actually a committee being started and a lot of research going into this. So you're going to be hearing a lot. This was just announced last week. So let me go ahead and stop sharing. Let me show the video. It's just a couple of minutes from a Bay Area newscast of Julian Glover, who does the kind of cultural and racial issues for the Bay Area on their local channel. So let me go ahead and share the video. I think you'll like it, but this is a story of a Marin couple who had their a dramatic a low ball appraisal. So let me go ahead and do the audio thing, and let's watch a couple minutes.
Story of a Marin couple who almost got cheated out of $500,000.
You know what I mean? It was work, but it was exciting.
Paul and his wife Tanisha Austin felt like they captured a slice of the American dream in 2016 when they purchased their first home together, this original Marin City pole home. But it wasn't without challenges.
As soon as like a house came on the market, you go in, you put your bid in, and then you get outbid it by like 100,000 or more rather quickly. And that can be, you know, a little bit depressing.
They bought the home off market from another black family hoping to make homeownership a reality for a young black couple. After moving into the home built in the 1960s, the Austins staged major renovations, adding an entire floor and more than 1,000 square feet of space, along with a deck, new floors, a fireplace, and new appliances. Then they got it appraised.
I read the appraisal. I looked at the number and I was like, this is unbelievable.
The family tells me the appraiser was an older white woman and they're convinced race was a factor. The home appraised for $989,000, just $100,000 more than the Austins got it appraised for before they started the work, despite $400,000 in renovations.
It was like, you know, it was a slap in the face.
The Austins immediately called their lender and pushed back. After a month of escalating their complaints, they were approved for a second appraisal. When the date came, they got creative.
We had a conversation with one of our white friends, and she was like, no problem, I'll be Tanisha. I'll bring over some pictures of my family. She made our home look like it belonged to her.
And it worked.
So it appraised for 1.482.
Yeah.
Which was 50% more than what it appraised for by a couple weeks prior.
Almost 1.5, $500,000 more.
The Austins were outraged and believe this is another ugly result of larger systemic issues.
There were implications of the ability to create generational wealth or pass things on if our house is appraised for 50% less than what is valued at.
We know discrimination is in nearly every aspect of the home buying process, and really we need to be addressing it as an industry.
Discrimination.
All right, I'm going to stop it there. But, you know, I think that video segment, again, just shows us the extent of the issues we're facing and just a real relevant example from this year. And I saw this report because there was another appraisal case that was notified on the news of a similar situation in the Bay. So I'm just pointing out that this is coming up. You're going to hear more about this, and it's a real important thing to understand. So let me just wrap it up before I turn it over to my other panelists here. Just wanted to say that just on Friday, the department released our housing harassment prevention guide. It's like a 18, 19 page guide for all housing providers in California that goes through what housing providers should do when a tenant complains about harassment, either against the housing provider or their contractors or another tenant. And we give you guidance on things that housing providers can do. And I would encourage folks, it's on our website right now on our main page, but this is something we can come around later and get deeper into, but harassment remains a big issue. We've seen the anti-Asian violence and bias-motivated violence, which violate our civil rights laws and our fair housing laws. But it's all the more relevant because there's a lot of harassment that happens at home, whether it be in an HOA or whether it be harassment that a prospective home buyer may get from a seller or other forms or even realtors. Know that we're all in this together, and I would encourage folks to look at our harassment prevention guide as well as another element of fair housing issues that we need to know. So with that, I'm going to cut out. You'll have these slides. This just talks about our complaint process. If there's questions on that later, we can get into it. And we have our new Keep California Fair campaign. You may be hearing commercials, and we have a lot of resources which I'll share this PowerPoint with you so you can get it on our website. But with that, let me go ahead and pass the mic to Molly, and looking forward to hearing.
Yes, before we do, I just want to again announce that Molly's going to be talking about implied bias. We see that we have some questions coming in. I'd like to go ahead and have Molly talk about implied bias. Some of the questions that are coming in really could be served by having Molly do her piece. Again, I didn't meet Molly, but I listened to her talk a couple of years ago up in Sacramento. And it was about implied bias. You know, we all come from different backgrounds, different generations, and we were raised a certain way, and we were told certain things, and even though we've grown up and a lot of our attitudes and things have changed, there's still a lot of stuff that's in there that maybe you don't even realize. And so I wanted to have Molly kind of talk to us about implied bias. This is very timely because the California legislature is currently considering a piece of legislation, I think it's AB 263, that will mandate 2 hours of implied bias training along with a test that you'll have to take. I have not seen the test. I don't know who's going to create the test, but you're going to all have to do that as a condition of your 45 hours of continuing education that you must all do. And this is actually being supported by the California Association of Realtors and their chief lobbyists. And so you're going to be hearing a lot more about implied bias, but thought I'd go to the top of the mountain and have Molly tell us a little bit about it. So Molly, you're on.
All right. Hello, hello. Can everybody hear me? Get a thumbs up from like my pan. Okay, great. Thank you so much, John, for hosting this very important program. And Brandon, your slides just put mine to shame. So thanks a lot for that. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, pull up a few slides. I have a short video, and we'll see if I can get this going. I'm going to optimize for video clip, I think. Okay. Okay, can everybody see? Let's see, hold on a second. Okay, now I've done something really funky. Okay. Can everybody see my slide? Can somebody, I can't see you all anymore. So if somebody could unmute themselves and just
Yeah, it looks
Yep,
good,
you're
Molly.
good. You're in
It's
full screen
perfect,
presentation
Molly.
mode. You're
We can
good.
see
Score.
Thank you. You would think after a year and a half of this, I would have gotten it, but no.
You
that's
just
not
need
the
more
case.
monitors.
I do need more monitors. Let's tell my boss. So I'm excited to talk to you today about implicit bias. Another phrase that we hear a lot is unconscious bias. Those are interchangeable. Unconscious bias, implicit bias. It's the stuff we don't even know we're thinking. Our laws prohibit discrimination. We have Brandon, we have the DFEH. We know better. And yet we keep hearing these stories. The ones about the orchestra, the one about the appraisal. What is going on? This is what I want to talk to you about today. What is going on? Why aren't we progressing faster? So I know you all have heard the conversations, I think, coming back from the Starbucks incident a few years ago, where after 2 African-American men were asked to leave the Starbucks because they hadn't ordered anything, even though they were waiting for a third person for a meeting, Starbucks stopped everything and had a day-long implicit bias training. So questions came up. What is implicit bias? Was that implicit bias? And so on. So I think that began kind of the national conversation about what the heck this is. But I'll go over it just to keep us all on the same page. Explicit bias, Brandon talked about this too, it's intentional bias. It's what we know we're doing. Implicit bias is much more insidious because we don't even know it's there. So it's a bias in judgment. It's basically the mental shortcut that fills in the gaps of our knowledge with similar data from our cultural norms and our past experiences. So a psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, he describes it as fast versus slow thought. And I really love that, right? Deliberate versus intuitive or snap judgment decision-making. So to get super geeky and sciencey about it, our natural fight or flight responses develop from a small interior part of our brain. And I pointed it back there, but I think it's up here. I actually don't know where it is. It's called the amygdala, right? And our amygdala is triggered an automatic alarm system or a distrust, and that's triggered by unconscious biases. Another way to think about this, and you might have heard of these terms before, it's the heuristics of system 1 versus system 2 thinking. So system 1, it's our snap judgment. System 2, it's what we use when we're filling out our tax forms. We're moving slowly, we're checking ourselves, we're checking it again. We're like, wait, what? That's not how much I owe. We're doing it very slowly and consciously, deliberately. System 1, we cannot function without both of these systems, system 1 and system 2 thinking. We can't function without both of them working together. Our brains are capable of processing 11 million bits of information per second. I had to reread that one, per second, right? So if we didn't have the snap judgment decision-making skill, we would literally be paralyzed in our parking lot. We wouldn't be able to get in the front door, right? So this is a really useful part of our brain. And it's one that we're not aware of most often. And it's one that can get us in trouble. So that's what we're talking about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about these 4 other types of bias that are part of unconscious bias. There are more, but we could be here all day, so I'll just talk about a few of them. Correspondence bias. So that's where our tendency to draw inferences about somebody's behavior or about somebody's personality based on their behavior, even when we don't have the backstory. So that driver is an idiot. What a jerk. They cut me off. They're going too fast. They're just a jerk, selfish jerk. Now, whereas when I'm driving fast and oops, maybe accidentally cut somebody off, it's because Owen couldn't find his shoes. It's because I got to get the kids to school on time. I have a presentation, right? So I find that there's a story that legitimizes or at least explains my jerky driving behavior, whereas I correspond a personality trait to somebody else based on their behavior without the story. Confirmation bias, that's the tendency to interpret new information as evidence of confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. So I knew she would ace that test. She's Asian. Ignoring the fact that my 3 other Asian friends didn't do so well on the test, right? In-group bias, status quo bias. Status quo bias is just like, I like it how it is. Can we not mess with the system? Like, I don't want to know anymore. Like, I'm fine, it's fine, it's fine. Let's not change anything. In-group bias is the tendency to favor people who are part of specific groups to which we belong. That's a really common one, right? We find it a lot in mentorship, right? In the legal profession. Oh, you went to my law school? I'll totally help you out. I don't know you, but yeah, I'm gonna come on in. Let me mentor you. And it's just the connection of that person having gone to the same law school that I did. It's one example. So this is our introduction to unconscious bias, and I'm going to try to play a quick video from Brene Myers. She's now at Netflix. I met her years ago when she presented at my national organization's annual retreat. I think it was in Boston. And I advise that you listen to the entire TED Talk at some point. It's How to Overcome Our Biases, Walk Boldly Toward Them. She's just great. A lot of fun to listen to. So here we go.
Stop trying to be good people. We need real people. You know, I do a lot of diversity work and people will come up to me at the beginning of a workshop. They're like, oh, Miss Diversity Lady, we're so glad you're here. But we don't have a bias bone in our body. And I'm like, really? Because I do this work every day and I see all my biases. I mean, not too long ago, I was on a plane and I heard the voice of a women pilot coming over the PA system, and I was just like so excited. I was so thrilled. I was like, yes, women, we are rocking it. We are now in the stratosphere, you know? It was all good, and then it started getting turbulent and bumpy, and I was like, I hope she can drive. I know, right, but it is not even like I knew that was a bias until I was coming back on the other leg. There's always a guy driving and it's often turbulent and bumpy, and I've never questioned the competence of the male driver. The pilot, it's good. Now here's the problem. It's like if you asked me explicitly, I would say, female pilot, awesome. But it appears that when things get funky and a little troublesome, a little risky, I lean on a bias that I didn't even know that I had. You know, fast moving planes in the sky, I want a guy. That's my default. Men are my defaults. Who is your default? Who do you trust? Who are you afraid of? Who do you implicitly feel connected to? Who do you run away from?
I love Renee's comment. When things get risky, I leaned on a bias I didn't even know I had. Right? So our jobs are to figure out what biases we might lean on when we're busy, when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we're not using fully our system 2 functioning, or we're just going by our gut impulse, right? And just use a little awareness. That's what we're doing today. That's what we're talking about. So implicit biases can manifest in so many different ways. Expectations about groups. There was a study done by Operario and Fisk called Stereotypes, where it was found that in general, communities consider mothers and the elderly community nice, but not so competent. And feminists and businesswomen were lumped together and they were considered competent, but not so nice, right? So these are group stereotypes that we may lean on when we don't even know it. So a 2014, next gen study revealed that identical legal memos written by hypothetical African-American and Caucasian people, both with the same name. This is hypothetical, right? So they could name them what they want. They both named them Thomas Meyer, and they were the identical legal memos. They had substantially different feedback when given to a group of lawyers. So the African-American student received a full point lower out of a 5-point scale than the Caucasian student, right? So again, I come back to, I have to believe that all of those lawyers looking at those memos weren't sitting there going, oh yeah, I'm gonna grade this guy lower because of his race or ethnicity. I can't believe that. I know we have some folks out there who are consciously discriminating, but I think that so much of how we're operating and why our systems aren't getting better faster is because we are doing things on a very unconscious level based on years and years of a history of discriminatory behavior of our ancestors, folks around us, whatever, right? Things that are coming into our conscious. Renee says at another point, we all had the same rain come down, right? We were all raised in the same culture or different cultures with different histories of stereotypes. So let's see. Why are we talking about this? Okay, so we're all screwed, right? We have these unconscious bias. Let's just go home and feel depressed because this isn't good. Not at all. So when implicit bias, while it's been shown to predict discriminative behavior. So that's one thing, and that's actually debatable depending on what studies you look at. So I want to give you that there are studies that show that there's not a direct link, like a direct causal connection. And there are studies that show that there is a direct causal connection. This is a really new area of study, of science, of law. And so we're kind of creating the plane as we fly it, as it were. So that is a point where there are people who disagree that implicit biases have been shown to predict behavior. But awareness of the existence of implicit bias has been shown to be key in changing behavior. That piece we know. If you're aware of it, you're not going to be as biased in your actions. And what we're here today to talk about, so I had somebody a couple of years ago come up to me at this point, I think, raise their hand and say, okay, so is this a conversation about just policing my thoughts? Like now you're just going to tell me what I can and can't think on an unconscious level? think it's a really, really valid point, right? That's not what this conversation is about. This conversation is about being aware of stuff that happens really quickly in our minds so that we can be aware of our actions, right? And this is also really important to be aware of other people, right? We're not always the ones who understand what's going on with our customer. Why does our customer or our client, why do they want this neighborhood and not this neighborhood? Why are they pushing me to show them this, but not this? Why is my team member behaving in this particular way, right? So this is something we all need to be aware of, not just for ourselves, but for the people around us, so we can have some semblance of kind of that critical thinking where we go, okay, what's really happening right now? It can just make us do our jobs better. So the good news is that we can change. Right? So how do we do this? The work is called debiasing or overriding implicit bias impulses, as it was so well put by a few scholars, Manzoorine Banaji and Jerry Kang. Recent discoveries regarding the malleability of the brain as it relates to bias provide the basis to imagine both individual and systemic change. So I'm going to definitely leave you on an optimistic note and not a pessimistic one. I'm a optimist by nature. For you all, where does implicit bias show up? Brandon talked about this earlier, right? We talked about the appraisal article was one that I was going to talk about, so I don't need to now. So thank you, Brandon. How much is the home worth? Who wants to live in it? What kinds of services are nearby, right? Some of the stuff we have no control over, some of it we do. Hundreds of decision-making points in a housing transaction of any kind, of a rental, lending, mortgage, sales, all of it, right? And at every single one of these decision-making points, we have the opportunity to assess whether we might have some implicit bias showing up in that interaction. So there are two ways we can look at this. We can talk about systemic problems, right? Segregated neighborhoods as a consequence of past exclusionary zoning and housing laws, right? We have services to neighborhoods. We have buses, pools, parks. Where are all the good parks, right? Lulus, I'm sure you're all aware of that term. It's locally undesirable land uses. Freeways, where does the freeway go, right? And how do you navigate around that as a realtor? Housing consumer choices. You don't always have control over that either, right? So the two things kind of showing up, systemic problems and then housing consumer choices. We have I was going to talk about there's a 2018 Brookings and Gallup institution study that found that homes in majority Black, I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong, homes in majority Black neighborhoods were appraised for 23% less than properties in white neighborhoods. So, we have decades of research talking about bias in mortgage lending, including redlining. Some of that was explicit. And now I think it's showing up a little more strongly in the implicit bias realm rather than the explicit bias realm. So Black neighborhood homes, as we were just looking at with the appraisal issue, have been devalued on average, this is from that same Gallup poll study, $48,000 per home. So nationwide, that looks like $156 billion cumulatively lost nationwide in just that one community, in the African-American community. So consider all of the other communities that we might be concerned about, right? This is being recognized on a national level. Again, this is the optimist in me. This is the positive part. Rodman Schley, the president of the Appraisal Institute, which has about 17,000 members, says you've got to recognize that bias exists, especially unconscious bias. And I know that he and his organization are doing, making steps to try to address some of those things. So what do we do? What can we do about all of this? So eliminating bias in real time looks like increasing your structures, right? Having clear, agreed upon, prioritized criteria for certain decision-making points, reducing the number of subjective gray areas. That'll help minimize that opportunity for bias. We talk about that with the legal profession a lot. We talk about it with hiring, right? Who's on your team and how do you hire? when you have a hiring, system, you're less likely to lean on some of those unconscious biases, the confirmation bias or the in-group bias, than you might otherwise. So I love this one. Learn from surprises. Have you ever had a phone call or have you ever met somebody in person for the first time after having a series of phone calls or emails and been surprised? Right? Like, oh, I did not expect that person to be in a wheelchair. I did not expect that person to be so tall, short. I did not expect that person to have dark skin, right? So when you find yourself just that moment of surprise, that's a really great opportunity to check in with yourself at a later time and just kind of think, okay, what was that about? What was that about, Molly? Why did you totally just assume this about this person? Slowing down is key, right? Because again, our amygdala is responding when we're stressed, when we feel like we're in danger or we're threatened, or when we're just really, really tired. So slowing down and allowing our system 2 decision-making skills to come into play a little bit more will undoubtedly help you recognize if you feel like maybe there's a bias, or recognize bias in other people or other interactions, right? Team trainings, I like to always just say, you know what, this is a team effort, right? And it's always good. Pop on a TED Talk by Renee Myers once in a while with your team. It's just great. It's an ongoing process. We're not bad trying to become good. We are good people trying to do the right thing, and it's a process. It's an ongoing process for me. I can tell you that much, definitely. So here's one thing. When we talk about structures and increasing kind of maybe like systematizing things, we sometimes tend to start thinking about automating everything. And I just read an article that I thought was really interesting about AI, right? AI algorithms were found to have generated lower loan prices for borrowers of color. So even our systems are biased. Great. Guess why? Because they were made by humans who have implicit biases. And who aren't taking in maybe into account historical realities, or there are several reasons why this might be happening. So it's important if you just Google like AI, algorithm, loan pricing, housing, any of those things, you can come up with at least a handful of articles. And I think it's fascinating because it's kind of where we're trying to go with this stuff. Was really well-intentioned, but we gotta slow down and make sure it's actually working. Take the implicit association test. Harvard has a website that's all about IAT and implicit bias. And it can be really informative. Remember, our brains are malleable. If you take one of those tests and it's really discouraging, that's okay, right? That's okay. Our brains are malleable. We can take the test a different day, a different time. It might be a little bit different. We can expose ourselves to, some de-biasing techniques, and it might be different even still after that. So that's kind of the positive, the hopeful part of all of this. So when we talk about kind of what we find if we take an IAT, or again, if you have any kind of doubt about the IAT, which is definitely a body of folks out there who are like, no, I'm not sure about the science about that one. There's another one that's being touted as a really great replacement for that, or supplement to that, which is the affect misattribution procedure, the AMP. So that's another test that's out there. But, we talk about this thing called micro inequities. And I know that's a phrase that some folks feel like, oh my gosh, it's just one of those catchphrases. It's overused. I had a law student a few years ago say, like, if I hear the word micro inequity another time, but they're really important. And that's why we talk about them a lot. And they're small things, right? They're small events, small things that we say that some hard to prove, they're ephemeral, they're often unintentional, they're unrecognized by the perpetrator, by the person saying them, but they matter. They're meaningful, right? So small little things, continually mispronouncing somebody's name, giving too much credit for an easy task to one person, condescending. Oh my gosh, you're so well spoken. Yeah, I went to law school or whatever, right? Like, maybe only praising difficult tasks of other people. Check your facial expressions, right? You're, dismissing the idea of one employee while embracing the same idea, but when it's, stated by another employee, all of those different things that we can just be aware of, right? I think that's all I wanted to talk about. Oh, the last thing, I knew I had one more thing on that, which is expose your teams and yourself to counter stereotypical situations and even images. They've shown, they did a study where just putting the people in the test, just put positive images of leaders of different protected classes. So somebody in a wheelchair and somebody of Indian descent and, a bunch of different people who are all leading in their communities. I think there was a, female basketball player. They had just a bunch of different kind of maybe counter stereotypical images on their wall. And 24 hours later, they took, I think it was the IAT, the implicit association test, and had drastically different results from the first time they took it before they had those images on their walls. So we can do a lot. So I am not going to take any more time. Brandon was helpful with telling us a little bit about the law, so I don't need to go into that today with you all, but implicit bias has come up in the law and in cases. First kind of major space that it showed up was a quote by Justice Anthony Kennedy in a fair housing case. Recognition of disparate impact liability under the Fair Housing Act also plays a role in uncovering discriminatory intent, permits plaintiffs to counteract unconscious prejudices and disguised animus that escape easy classification as disparate treatment. So it's interesting because now as the law has evolved and as the theories of implicit bias have evolved, implicit bias is actually being used more to prove disparate treatment than it is to prove disparate impact. So the difference between the disparate treatment, that's where I am treating you differently than you based on a protected class, right? Disparate impact is, I just have this rule and it happens to be having an effect on you that's different from you in a protected class, right? That's the difference between those. So it's interesting that Justice Kennedy saw it going one way, saw the role of implicit bias in the law going kind of being supported by this disparate impact liability. But really what we see is that it's being used to prove disparate treatment more than disparate impact. So for what that's worth for y'all. We do have some, and I think John referenced the upcoming bill that may be coming out, but we do have in California, AB 241, 242, and 243. So mandating implicit bias training and testing for all medical professionals, judges and court personnel in the state, and for all law enforcement officers. And the only one I could find at this point, but I think there are more coming, is in Illinois. There's also mandated training that includes implicit bias for peace officers. Happily, you get to skip my lecture on case law. You've heard enough, I think, for one day about that. And again, Brene Myers has this great, very, readable book, What If I Say the Wrong Thing? 25 Habits for Culturally Effective People, that I recommend. And then there's this Implicit Bias and Philosophy International Research Project, which has a lot of interesting data.
Molly, thank you so much. Again, now you understand why I wanted her to be on this panel along with the other two great speakers. Speaking of great speakers, I've heard Matt on a number of occasions, and in addition to being a real estate broker himself with agents that work for him, he, if I recall correctly, Matt, you have a JD, a Juris Doctorate degree, was smart enough not to join the dark side of the force. He is a leader, not just in his state where he was the president. He is also a leader at the national level on a topic that is near and dear to my heart and to Lori's heart, certainly, and Laura's, and that is the Code of Ethics, and recently headed up a group that has changed both policy and the standards of practice relative to hate speech. So, Matt, we got a lot to talk about. We've heard there's a lot of law out there that can get a realtor in a lot of trouble. There's a lot of things we can do unconsciously to get ourselves in a lot of trouble. You've been a leader and have trained brokers and have fired brokers and agents. Give us some guidance on some of the stuff that you've seen and how we might do a better job.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, that was a very scattershot. Right. Of course. So I'm going to give you a little introduction to myself just so you have some context. I find myself frequently explaining to people who have known me only in the last couple of years that they would be inclined to think I came out of the womb as a social justice activist. And what I will tell you is my mother is the daughter of a Southern Baptist preacher from Mississippi. And my father was raised on the south side of Chicago, the son of an uneducated Italian immigrant railroad worker. And he held elected office as a Republican until retiring after having been the prosecutor in my local county, home county, and then a judge for decades. So he held elected office as a Republican my entire life up until 7 months ago. I am the world's most improbable diversity, equity, inclusion, fair housing, and social justice activist. So I tell you that so you understand where I'm coming from, and that most of what you're going to hear from me over the next few minutes is reflective of a journey that is ongoing and that has taken place over kind of a remarkably short period of time. I'm going to start with a little appended Realtor specific information that I think will be a complement to what Molly was sharing with you. So I'm going to fire up a screen share. Hopefully everyone's seeing that. Can I get a thumbs up from a panelist? Okay, very good. So I want to make sure that our realtors are aware that the National Association of Realtors has an outstanding resource called Bias Override. So everything that Professor Molly was talking about is incredibly important and useful. But a lot of times when you are bombarded with that information in the world of real estate, so what do I do with this? And what does this look like in our universe as realtors? So it's important to note that this section that is free, it's not behind a paywall or a login site, Bias Override, National Association of Realtors, it's about an hour, I think an hour and 15-minute long training session. So it is very specifically the intersection of what Molly was talking about with real estate practice. And also, consistent with what Molly was saying, the reason that the program is called Bias Override is because you do have the ability to override it. I often make an autopilot versus flying manually analogy here. When an autopilot system is working well, it is processing information from sensors and it's doing the calculations faster than a human could possibly respond to that stuff. And under most circumstances, that serves the flying public and the pilots very well. But when you get into these situations, and I'll go back to a really, really good phrase that I loved hearing from Molly, learn from surprises. Novel situations are the equivalent of, I'm now in meteorological aviation conditions where I really need to take it off autopilot because something's liable to go very badly wrong. I'm going to learn from that and do it. So I can't recommend this strongly enough because it will go into a little more detail than Molly did, but it is all done at the specific intersection of our practice in the world of real estate. Bias Override. Now, one of the other fun things that I hear all the time, I was raised not to see color. And people that look like me like to say that. And when people who look like me say it, they're usually trying to make the point that they were raised without intentional conscious discrimination, i.e. I certainly wasn't raised to believe that some other race or religion is inherently inferior to me. There's lots of problems with this, but one of the big ones is, to a person of color, when somebody who looks like me says it, that is received, that is heard and felt an awful lot like, I am choosing not to see an important part of who you are. And I have talked about this in presentations over the last couple of years a bunch, but a local lender friend of mine posted this on Facebook, and I'll read it. I know it's fine print depending on the size of your monitor. Posted this just in the last, 2 or 3 weeks, and gave me permission to use it because it's exactly what I've been talking about. When you say I don't see color, what you think you're saying is I see everyone as equal, and you stand proud in it. But what you're actually saying is that you don't see me for who I really am. You don't see my roots. You don't see or care to see the struggles I and people who look like me have daily, and you're blind to it. You don't see the fight and hard-earned accomplishments in spite of, but unfortunately, we're not always equal. I've walked into many rooms and been the only one. I've been uncomfortable. I have been judged. I have been ridiculed. I have been denied. And so have you, I'm sure, but it was likely not simply because of the color of your skin. Let's normalize seeing color. See me for who I am. See me for my roots. See my melanin and ask questions if you have them. I am brown. I am a person of color. See my color. Implicit bias is something that all of us have. Now, when people who look like me hear implicit bias, hear institutional bias, hear institutional or organizational racism, it's very, very easy for people who look like me to hear that as you're a racist. And that then goes back to this, well, I was raised not to see color. I don't have a discriminatory thought in my head or bone in my body. And indeed, the whole point of implicit bias is you don't have a conscious thought that's racist. It is implicit. And one of the thought exercises that I challenge people with is if you put yourself on a dark urban street in an unfamiliar neighborhood and you see a group of pedestrians in hoodies on the same side of the same street on the sidewalk approaching you, you can't really tell me that the race of those other pedestrians is not factored somewhere into your brain's threat assessment. That's not to say it's evil, but it just is. I co-present At Home with Diversity on virtual stages all over the country with my friend Robert Morris, and he's black, and he says just time after time after time gets into an elevator with white women and they are clutching their purses in a way that is altogether different than what they would do if his skin color were different. So my point in this is own it and deal with the bias override. Don't deny that it exists. And that's where I'm going next, that it exists. I'm the only white person in my family. My wife is a Filipino immigrant. As my children would say, my wife is brown, my children are beige. I'm the only white person in my own household. Again, by way of context, I have spent, during my leadership journey with the Illinois Realtors, I'm from Champaign, Central Illinois, cornfields, 130 miles south of Chicago. But when I was on the state leadership team, and gradually became aware that we had a serious inclusion problem in leadership, by lack of inclusion, what I mean is our board of directors in 2017 was 100% white. 100% white. We have a very diverse city that had by the 60s, had a black population of over 1 million people. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's called Chicago. And I'm like, we've got to be doing something wrong if we are 100% white on our board of directors. So I set about very intentional outreach, particularly in the black real estate community, where I have on purpose become very accustomed to being the only white person in a lot of rooms on the south side of Chicago. After having done that for years, my own, this is that Harvard IAT test result that Molly referenced earlier, your responses suggested a moderate automatic preference for white people over black people. And I'm not disputing the findings. I'm simply pointing out it is what it is, and that's in spite of somebody who is very used to being the only white person in the room. Another one of these testing tools is if you're looking at this screen and you actually are looking frame by frame, going in columns at the shape of the mouth is absolutely identical from the top figure to the bottom figure in each column. And yet large groups of people in well-publicized research studies don't report the black face as being happy until it is at the far right frame, really, really over the top, clearly an overt smile. By contrast, the white face is reported to be happy at the middle right frame. Totally, absolutely identical mouth shape, and yet the read from audiences on, oh, well, it's relatively speaking, that's an angry black person versus a neutral or happy white person. This is the book Molly referenced, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is phenomenal. I read this long before I was thinking about implicit bias in a race-related situation. It is written by a Nobel laureate, but is incredibly useful. And that is the Thinking Fast or Slow, the fast autopilot system versus the slow. And going back to the National Association of Realtors bias override, and what Molly said in her remarks, which was slow down. Well, the slowing down really is code for, and the book is very good at helping to provide insights. A lot of the book demonstrates the tricks your brain will play on you in the autopilot world. And then, much like the bias override module, teaches you when I need to force something into my conscious awareness so that I can fly the plane on manual control, so that I can learn from that surprise, so I can learn from that training, so I realize, no, I'm being asked a question that I prepared for because I trained for it. Well, how would you describe the schools in this neighborhood? When you're in a real estate professional's world, there are certain questions you're gonna get. And they're reflective of things that are in the questions here. Well, I want to live in a neighborhood with Asians. How many Asians are here? That was one of the questioners that wrote that. You need to be prepared for that so that when you are surprised, it's not in front of the client and you give an answer that reflects that. So it's super, super useful, but that just goes back to that theme of learn about the bias so that you can do a manual override as needed. Now, as I've been on my journey and learned about the awful, awful history of housing discrimination that our trade organization was a massive perpetrator of, and I'll get into a little bit of that in a minute. I thought, well, I'm here in Champaign, Illinois. I'm in a Big Ten research-driven university economy. We've got the highest average level of education of any of the counties in Illinois. We've got this 52,000 student flagship campus of the University of Illinois system. So it really sucks that you had all that redlining stuff that happened in major cities in California and Illinois, but that would never happen here. And then in 2018, I was speaking at a fair housing event in the city of Chicago, and this HUD attorney that you see pictured here approached me on the sidelines after I was done speaking. And because she heard I was from Champaign, as is she. Turns out her mother was a dearly beloved guidance counselor at our high school that we went to, and I was in classes with her younger sister. And she's literally in the fair housing business. And she said, oh yeah, Champaign is where I experienced my first instance of housing discrimination. And this is going to go back to another one of the things that Molly said, learn from your surprises. She said, I don't sound black on the phone. And so as a young woman, time after time after time, I would call about apartments available for rent, confirm by phone they were available for rent, and time after time after time, when a black woman showed up in person, they were no longer available. And then I realized this happens everywhere, because if it weren't going to happen somewhere, it wouldn't happen here. And it happens here. And it just led to this sad realization. It's happening everywhere. I remember when I was leading the charge on the Code of Ethics changes last year, I had a huge broker owner from a large southern metro area. I mean, I think his agent count was over 1,000, who engaged me in a very civil, but heated discourse over, I'm offended by the proposals because your proposals imply that we have housing discrimination. Well, that's because you do. Now I'm going to give you all a little sad history. This is all near and dear to my heart because it has not escaped the significance of sitting in a chair, chairing one of the largest committees of the National Association of Realtors that is collectively the keepers of the code. There is some god-awful baggage in our history that goes with that, that has really weighed on me as I have been on my journey in the last few years. So I'm going to take you back nearly 100 years to former Article 34. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. In other words, there would have been an ethical mandate to engage in housing discrimination because you bring the wrong group of people in and you are tanking property values. That was 97 years ago. And the last vestiges of that discriminatory language were not fully eradicated from the NAR Code of Ethics until 1974. That's 6 years after fair housing had been made the law of the land, and the last vestiges of the discriminatory language that started here weren't gone until 6 years later. Why did it take so long? Because the National Association of Realtors was fighting tooth and nail against fair housing. So I'm going to jump into a little history, and the history I'm jumping into is designed to be roughly contemporaneous with what you're seeing here. And Chicago's Red Summer was part of Red Summer across cities all over the United States. So now we're going back 102 years. And in Chicago, this started when Eugene Williams was on the wrong side of the imaginary color line that goes all the way across Lake Michigan from the city of Chicago. You had the Black Belt, and you had the water reserved for white swimmers and an imaginary line. This sketch ran on the front page of the Chicago Tribune after Eugene Williams crossed the color line, the invisible color line. There was no rope, and was pelted with rocks in the head until he drowned and died, and the police did nothing about it. And race riots broke out. Hundreds of people were injured. Dozens of people were killed. It was about 2 to 1 African Americans killed versus white people. And this is what that city looked like. The city of Chicago looked like during Red Summer of 1919. These are white folks celebrating, white children celebrating the burning and destruction of a black family's house while they're there. This is a mob carrying bricks and stones that they're pelting a black man with as they chased him through the streets of the Black Belt neighborhood in the alleyways of Chicago. And here you see police just staring over this black person who's bleeding out from a head wound during Red Summer. This is what that looked like. In fact, the origins of street gangs were black males attempting to stand watch over their neighborhoods against the roving white marauders that were seeking to destroy their property and kill the black residents there. So there was a report. There was an after-action report that the city of Chicago commissioned. So this is now a public domain document. It's hundreds of pages long. Came out right around the time of that 1924 NAR code, the Negro in Chicago. And what I want to focus on, which dovetails exactly with that valuation issue that we talked about earlier, the appraisal issue, is a section on Negroes and property depreciation. And I mention this because as I read this excerpt, you substitute African American or black for the word Negroes, and dang near everything in this section could apply when you're looking at these appraisal-related stories that are still making news today in major newspapers across the country. No single factor has complicated the relations of Negroes and whites in Chicago more than the widespread feeling of white people that the presence of Negroes in the neighborhood is a cause of serious depreciation of property values. To the extent that people feel their financial interests are affected, antagonisms are accentuated. When a Negro family moves into a block in which all other families are white, the neighbors object. This objection may express itself in studied aloofness, in taunts, warnings, slurs, threats, or even the bombing of their homes. White neighbors who can do so are likely to move away at the first opportunity. Assessors and appraisers, in determining the value of the property, take account of this general dislike of the presence or proximity of Negroes. It matters little what type of citizen the Negro family may represent, what their wealth or standing in the community is, or that their motive in moving into a predominant white neighborhood is to secure better living conditions. Their appearance is a signal of depreciation. So it happens that when a Negro family moves into a block, most of the white neighbors show resentment toward both the Negro family and the owner or agent who rents or sells the property. Whites owning homes in the neighborhood become much exercised by fear of loss, both of money and neighborhood exclusiveness and desirability. The Negro suffers under the realization that for reasons which he cannot control, he is considered undesirable and a menace to property values. Wherever Negroes have moved in Chicago, this odium has attached to their presence. The belief that they destroy property values wherever they go is now commonly taken as a valid explanation of any unfriendliness toward the entire group. We're almost 100 years later, and we're dealing with the exact issue. I said earlier, why did NAR take years after fair housing to be able to update the code? Because they were busy during the 1960s distributing forced housing kits, which among other gems had, let's see, what is it called? Civil rights programs for moderates, i.e. how to oppose fair housing without sounding like a flaming bigot. This is all part of our trade organization's fingerprints on this. And there was a study in the city of Chicago just published 2 years ago, May of 1919. How do you put a value on what we have stolen from the Black community through housing discrimination. And indeed, in the city of Chicago, a value was put on it. This study looked at one generation, one city, one segment of the population, the Black population in the city of Chicago in the 50s and 60s. And over just those 2 decades in that one segment, in that one city, $3.2 to $4 billion in 2019 dollars expropriated from the Black community. So I am young enough to have only lived years after the Fair Housing Act was passed. So it's not that I've lived in an era where housing discrimination was legal or most other types of discrimination was legal, but it sure as heck is the reason that my Black peers, when I was in Champaign public schools, would have had to have worried why there may not be money to send them to college when my family with a legacy of homeownership did not have that concern. This is my friend Frank Williams, whose house was firebombed in 1975 in the city of Chicago because he was selling real estate while Black and selling Black people homes in the Beverly neighborhood in the city of Chicago. I'm proud to count him as a friend, but he lived through terrorism years after fair housing became the law of the land. And then the last part I'm going to talk about quickly is having gotten really used to being the only white guy in a lot of rooms on the south side of Chicago, I'm going to run through some lessons I've learned as that white guy outlier. And these are all photos I've taken from events I've attended. So what I found is we've got Black real estate professionals today who are doing twice the work for half the pay. That goes back to the depreciated values in Black neighborhoods. You've got the Black practitioners who are looked askance when they're working in predominantly white neighborhoods. What are you doing here? How did you get that client? How did you get that listing out here? They're presumed by white colleagues to have unqualified clients. They have to diversify their businesses to withstand recessions and low Black homeownership rate. In other words, I'm seeing an awful lot of very small shops where they're doing brokerage, they're doing property management, they're doing renovation, they're doing development, they're doing rehabs, they're doing flips. They have to do it all because they have to be more versatile than I can even wrap my head around because the Black homeownership rate is so low, and especially during the mortgage meltdown that led into the Great Recession, you had a last in, first out. Black homeowners were finally getting a foothold in the market, but it was because of predatory loans, and they were the very first ones to be crushed. We have an underrepresentation of members of color in leadership, and it's in our membership, and an even greater underrepresentation when we're looking at actual volunteer leadership roles. I've watched, after I've developed a lot of truly life-changing, transformative friendships with Black colleagues, I have watched them bounce off glass ceilings I didn't know existed 5 years ago when they do attempt to get involved. And they have to do so, be willing to get involved knowing they're going to be the only one and that they're going to bounce off of the glass ceiling and have to come back with a battering ram, which is not normal human nature. Racist slurs and hate speech, which is the item that I worked on for revising the Code of Ethics last year, remain common in the marketplace. Black colleagues are constantly anticipating the next embarrassing, dehumanizing, racist episode. And Joanne Poole, past president of Maryland, works in Metro Baltimore. She was part of a panel that I hosted a year ago this month on race and real estate. And she described in modern history repeatedly, not several times in a year, but a few times over a few years, literally being left out on the front stoop when she was showing houses to white buyer clients. Homeowner would say to the clients, you can come in, say to the Black realtor, you will wait outside. And as Joanne said, I don't know if that cost me more in embarrassment or in money in my pocket, those episodes. And this is what's still ongoing. Quick final story. I talked about Black colleagues still presumed to have unqualified clients. This is my dear friend, Michelle Mills Clement, the CEO of the Chicago Association of Realtors. Michelle was hired into that prestigious role in early 2018, Q1 or Q2 of 2018. She's a Southside native, but she was coming from the Seattle area at the time. So it was a homecoming for her. And Michelle occupies a corner office on the 8th floor of the Realtor building overlooking the Mag Mile. This is a really, really amazing job. She works as the CEO of an organization that would not have admitted her as a member on the basis of skin color alone until 1963. So Michelle, looking to rent initially a high-end, high-rise rental within walking distance of her office, called her good friend, Kimberly Offord. Kimberly Offord's a Southside realtor, very successful, also a friend, to help get her into a high-end rental in the neighborhood. And when Kimberly made an inquiry on Michelle's behalf about an available rental in that area of the city, the Landlord representative agent asked, well, is your client a housing voucher recipient? In other words, Black South Side agent couldn't possibly be representing a tenant who would be qualified on her own merits for a property like this. This is what's happening now. This was 2018. And Michelle initially didn't even share the story because when she mentioned it in her office and some of her colleagues, all of these folks I know, had said, you got to file a complaint, Michelle. And she said, if I filed a complaint for every time I've been discriminated against, my entire life would be consumed with filing complaints and I couldn't get my work done. Ultimately, she at least has told the story. And this happened, as I said, 3 years ago. And it just occurred to me a few weeks ago, I know Kimberly, but I had never told Kimberly that conversation, hearing that story, around a table before I was in ProStandard's leadership. I was just one seat around the table, but there was a proposal to add to our Article 3 cooperation mandate article, a new standard of practice that explicitly prohibits failure to cooperate on the basis of the cooperating agent's membership in a protected class. And I realized, I called her, Kimberly, early one morning. I don't talk to her often, so it took her a moment to figure out who I was. Hey, Kimberly, this is Matt DeFanis. Pause. Okay, hi, Matt. I said, Kimberly, I just realized I never circled back to you to let you know that story that happened to you and Michelle in 2018. I don't think you know this, but that resulted in some righteous outrage, some really important conversations. And when that conversation was happening around a table that I was just one vote at, initially NAR Legal said, no, we don't want to have a new standard of practice that would imply that this was okay before, and we think it's already implicitly prohibited. And I said, well, implicit's not good enough. So I kind of raised a stink, and ultimately we have standard of practice 3-11 that explicitly prohibits it. I said, it has to be explicit. This has to be trumpeted from the mountaintops. And so I said, Kimberly, I'm sorry I didn't think to tell you this sooner, but your story of something awful and dehumanizing and just plain wrong on so many levels, you were heard. That story means something, and your fingerprints and your name are written all over Standard of Practice 3-11, now enshrined in the National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics. So it's just interesting. We got all this historical baggage, and yet some moments for some incredible progress. Final suggested reading. Color of Law. This is a game changer. Everyone in real estate has to read this. This really should be mandatory reading. I can't overstate how bad, how awful, how multifaceted, multi-layered the history of discrimination largely perpetrated by our trade organization and our industry has been against Black and brown communities, but especially Black communities. And I conclude segments like this because I've ended up with a lot of guilt. When you learn the history, it's just shameful. And it's hard to carry that around and not just be weighed down by it. And so in the spirit of finishing with a challenge to do something good with all of this awful stuff, I'm going to quote one of my other suggested reading materials, which is Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. And she finishes her book with a call for radical empathy. So I'm going to conclude my remarks with this segment. When an accident of birth aligns with what is most valued in a given caste system, whether being able-bodied, male, white, or other traits in which we had no say, it gives that lottery winner a moral duty to develop empathy for those who must endure the indignities they themselves have been spared. It calls for a radical kind of empathy. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is looking across at someone and feeling sorrow, often in times of loss. Empathy is not pity. Pity is looking down from above and feeling a distant sadness for another in their misfortune. Empathy is commonly viewed as putting yourself in someone else's shoes and imagining how you would feel. That could be seen as a start, but that is little more than role-playing, and it is not enough in the ruptured world we live in. Radical empathy, on the other hand, means putting in the work to educate oneself and to listen with a humble heart to understand another's experience from their perspective, not as we imagine we would feel. Radical empathy is not about you and what you think you would do in a situation you have never been in and perhaps never will. It's the kindred connection from a place of deep knowing that opens your spirit to the pain of another as they perceive it. Empathy is no substitute for experience itself. We don't get to tell a person with a broken leg or bullet wound that they are or are not in pain. And people who have hit the caste lottery are not in a position to tell a person who has suffered under the tyranny of caste what is offensive or hurtful or demeaning to those at the bottom. The price of privilege is the moral duty to act when one sees another person treated unfairly, and the least that a person in the dominant caste can do is not make the pain any worse. Isabel Wilkerson.
Wow. I hardly know where to begin. I know we have questions. I cannot tell you three how valuable to me personally. I can't speak for the hundreds of people that are listening, but I feel empowered by a lot of what I heard today. I know that a lot of people do. Laura, have you been looking at I know I have a bunch of questions, and they're more practical. I won't say practical, that's not the right word, but sort of day to day. I'm out there, I'm selling real estate. I'm not really, I'm the one defending the ones that these people are when you cross that line. And frankly, it's getting harder and harder to do that. And I believe that we're going to see a real growth in this industry in terms of people coming after realtors for doing the kinds of things that they ought not to be doing. And frankly, that means not just at the civil side with the loss of money, but we're talking about things like the Department of Real Estate will take your license away as they should. The Department of Fair Housing may come after you on a claim, obviously civil lawyers. But the sense that I get in talking to both Laura and Lori is that the vast majority of realtors, particularly in the two associations that are represented today, are to do the right thing. So with that in mind, I'm going to start off with the topic that comes up all the time, and that is advertising. And I'll let Lori and Laura take a look at some of the specific questions, but I have a question, and since I'm the moderator and I've unmuted myself, I'm going to go ahead and ask it. So I want to advertise. I want to do the right thing. I want to make sure that to minimize my surprises, as Molly called it. Give me some tips. We'll start with Brandon, I guess. Give me some tips on just quickly on some of the words I might want to be careful of, some of the things I might consider as I go through and create my advertising campaign for my client on the list side.
Well, that's a great question, John. And there's been a long history with advertisements and going back to the New York Times cases of models and only depicting predominantly white people in all the ads. So we have a long history here. But in terms of statements, I think the key thing you'll hear is you can't make any kind of advertisement that seems to be indicating a preference for somebody, right? We need to be talking about the attributes of the property, not indicating a preference this is. And some things are benign, but this is the place for kids. Kids, or it's next to the church, and you like it. You go to mass on Sundays. There's a lot of things, but I think that what I see with discriminatory ads, and now often it's more of a source of income issues around Section 8 that we see. But in terms of listing properties, I think the key of realtors is you're talking about the attributes of the property. We do not talk about indicating a preference or who may like to live here more than others based on a protected basis. So I couldn't give you an exclusive list. Certainly indicating any protected basis is a problem, right? It's going to be on its face a problem. But I think you still want to shy away from other ways to give an innuendo that there's a preference of who wants to live here, because all of that will be evidence when there is a discrimination case of saying, look, they said this, here was the ad, and it all goes together. So I think, you're, and as Tamala, you talked about, putting some process in place when we do this, right? Making sure it's being reviewed, making sure you're just, listing the property and its attributes. But those would be the contours, but I would certainly ensure that we're not talking about a protected basis in a listing or in an ad. Yeah.
Molly, as I think about putting my advertising together, it would seem to me that this is a good place to start catching myself in terms of the adjectives and the words that I use to describe that property, because that might be one place where I can start testing myself. Am I implicitly showing a bias by the way I describe that property?
Exactly right, John. And I think, one thing I've done in the past is I've used my friends and coworkers and community to help me see my blind spots, because I have them, right? We all have blind spots around there somewhere, and I know I have them. So I might prepare a new protocol for my team, and then I might send it around to a bunch of different colleagues and say, do you see anything? Am I missing anything? Am I generalizing? Am I not addressing something here? Am I assuming? And that can be a way to help catch those blind spots.
Man, I know you sell a lot of real estate. How do you oversee, as in California, a broker is obligated to oversee the advertising of their agents and their broker associates. How do you do that and make sure that your agents and broker associates aren't in fact creating implied biases in terms of their advertising? Give me some tips on how to do that.
I would say the biggest thing that I see that concerns me that my folks aren't doing, but it's something I'm watching for. Think about the times that you would see advertisements, development brochures for a new neighborhood. Oh, look at all the white people they show enjoying that new housing development. It's really, really important if you're going to have people depicted in any kind of advertising, if you are going to have people depicted, it needs to be a very, very inclusive group. Now, that's super easy to accomplish with a good subscription to a stock photography service. So it's easily accomplished, but just like initially it didn't register with me that we were doing something wrong when we had when I was a member of an all-white board of directors. Once you start seeing through that lens of, hey, wait a minute, look who we're leaving out, or if I put myself in the shoes of somebody in a group that doesn't look like me, this is going to certainly look and feel exclusive in all the wrong ways. So I'd say that's probably the thing. And then also you look at images and social media. That's one of those other areas. Just never miss a chance. If you're going to choose to use images in our line of work, never miss a chance to intentionally select either inclusive stock photography or make sure you're intentionally assembling an inclusive group of people if you're going to feature that in advertising.
And just to add on real quick to Matt's point, John, also, where are you listing? Where are you putting your advertisements? Are they in only a selective media that may only be read by one person, or is there more there? So I think that's another important piece is where are you advertising, so as to not create a preference by, I'm only going to advertise in this business journal that's only going to be read by this group and will never be seen by others. And I'm doing that with maybe some intent as well. These are some of the things that are actually being considered in our new regulations around discriminatory statements. So I encourage people to follow along, because these are some of the things being stated. Is actually listing out what are the issues with statements. And certainly the key in there is the indicating a preference. That's the big takeaway.
I know that when we defend realtors here in California with the Department of Real Estate, one of the first things the department always asks for are the training materials and other policies that the broker has generated. In that context, can you give me, and I'll just, whoever wants to go first, talk first. But what kind of tips would you recommend to a broker who's going to be putting together some checklists, some policy manuals to not only deal with the issues of advertising, which I think all of you have commented on, but also an issue that comes up all the time, which is how do you treat everybody the same? And that seems, when I read all these articles that have been, recommended to me, it keeps coming back to the same thing: treat everyone the same. And again, while that's a simplistic overstatement, the fact is, how do I do that in my training materials, and then how do I put that into practice? So, Matt, you shook your head first, so I'm going to go to you.
Well, here's what I would say. I'm going to go back to my aircraft analogy. We talked about autopilot versus flying manually. What happens, my wife thinks it's a morbid fascination of mine that I watch all these plane crash videos on YouTube. But what's so fascinating to me about it is when disaster is, and they don't all involve complete loss of the aircraft and mass fatalities. What's so interesting to me is when the aircraft, when everything has gone wrong, what you find is good flight crew are running through checklists. And that's what's so interesting is they will be found methodically running through their checklists right up until the very, very, very last second. And that's a super important technique that goes back to that world of bias override. Have checklists. Don't wait to learn from your surprise in the field without a safety net. Try to anticipate what those surprises would be, do the thought exercises so that you have already learned from the surprises and you are checklist driven. So, because think about it, if you're in a situation that's already an outlier to you, meaning you're dealing with a client or a background or a profile that is an anomaly to you and you feel like, I don't know what I'm going to do. The amygdala is already sending cortisol all through your body, thereby increasing the odds that a situation that's already uncomfortable to you is going to result in a blunder. And checklists are the best way to plan for that. Plan for the questions that you know you're going to get asked if you're in my line of work, and then make sure you have checklists to ensure uniformity of service across any of those classes.
I'm going to ask Molly a question, but I did a quick story is that I got on an airplane on Saturday afternoon, excuse me. And all of the flight attendants were there and they were all in their uniforms, some men, some women. There was a big plane. And then someone came out of the cockpit and she was wearing the uniform of the pilot. And I caught myself immediately going, whoa. Then I realized, the plane's the plane. Somebody can fly it if she's got the capability. Yay for her and yay for my daughter that might have that opportunity someday herself. And so, although that would not be good. But I know my daughter. So there's times, even when you're trying to just go about your life, something will come up and these are great moments to catch yourself in whatever that moment is and just realize that's what we're talking about. Molly, so I'm listening to Matt. It's good advice. I know that Lori and Laura and I scream and yell at our members all the time. Have checklists, put together things that, this way you can at least say, this is the common practice and have it. Who do we run it by? How do I perhaps take a look at the checklist on the issue of advertising, say, or on steering and making sure that I don't engage in where I'm pushing people into a certain neighborhood, which is obviously a major problem. How do I take a look at that and say to myself, all right, I think we're good here. Give me some tips on doing that.
So be like Matt. Put yourself in places where you're the minority, and put yourself in places where your colleagues are going to have a different perspective in some way or another, right? And I think for me, that's been the most effective way of making sure that my checklist, as it were, has contemplated all the things that I may not have contemplated. And then go to Brendan and say, okay, Brendan, DFEH, right? Look at my guideposts, look at what the samples out there, see who you trust. So I think, I did another presentation recently and I made the point that reading, we all just have this duty to educate ourselves, right? And so read as much as you can to make sure that you're catching everything that you can. We can't read ourselves out of isms, but we can it's a good starting point for all of us, right? I know I need a lot more. I wrote the books that Matt had up, and I've read a few, but not all of them. So I think continuing to just make sure we're still on our learning edge.
Speaking of steering, which I know is still an ongoing major problem with the reaching the goals that all of us have been talking about. Brandon, give me some thoughts on how do I avoid even unconsciously, I mean, if I'm consciously steering somebody, frankly, whether it's a lawyer or a good broker, or you're not going to get helped, right? I mean, you're in trouble and just a matter of time before you get caught. But I'm really trying to do the right thing. How do I avoid steering, whether it be in a rental situation or in a home purchase situation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and it certainly picks up on what Molly and Matt are talking about. But I think, you know, one way to avoid this is you first have to, like I said, do this kind of overriding bias, right? You're entering the situation with a bias. It may be there from the past inequity. So we have to first kind of override it, that this, and kind of a false narrative, which is really based on segregation, that, hey, people want to live here because that's where they're from. That, you know, like as Richard Rothstein points out, it wasn't really like all the Black people got together and said, this is where we all want to live. And everyone, you know, there was reasons why this happened, right? Through restrictive covenants and segregation. So we have to first put that aside, that really wasn't like a choice. And so, I mean, that's our first step. And then I think our second step is going back to the checklist. You know, like, you know, the best way to protect yourself from a fair housing claim is to do everything the same, and to have, you know, some general criteria of what you're going to show, how many listings per person, and you're gonna kind of stay within a parameter, because some of the things that are found on testing, you know, through bias, show maybe you're willing to go to the extra mile for the prospective white home buyer. You're going to give them some other information you can give someone else. You know, these are where it comes out. Maybe that there wasn't an animus, but that bias comes in, and you're wanting to do more for this person because you know what it's like for this group, and it comes out that way. So I think you want to make sure you have some parameters. You know, in the Newsday case we looked at, you know, people weren't receiving the same amount of listings, even though they wanted to live in the same, you know, exact area. They were taking to different properties. So I think you have to really streamline that. I mean, even in the rental market, right? You know, if there's property available, you got to tell how many properties are available to each person, not what you think based on bias. Well, I'm not going to mention this because they came in here and they have kids, so they don't want to go on the second floor. We have to really check the bias, try to create a non-discriminatory way of selecting or doing what we do, so that if there is a problem, you're able to show, no, this is what we do. We didn't just take into account our bias, and just so happened, you know, anytime a Black prospective home buyer came in here, I never was showing them properties and where they wanted to live. And that's also the part that's always so hard about steering. They're telling you they want to live here, and then the bias is taking over. Saying, but I know places you would like, and it may not be from the animus, so you're not going to be comfortable. You're not going to like it. I know what you like, and so you see it play out time and time again. So I think the best way is listen to what the prospective buyer really wants. Check your buy, even if you believe you know the best neighborhood for them. You know, that's the intent of steering, that you were using that protected basis to move them to where we want. So I mean, I don't know like exactly every checklist, but I do think you want to standardize as much as you can, so that you can show if there is a complaint that everyone's treated the same amount of listings. I identify the property. I have a form they use. They tell me what they want. I'm able to show that, versus no system. And then you realize, oh, through unconscious bias, I've actually been doing blank or going the extra mile for these groups and not the other. That comes off and will be seen as discrimination.
One of the questions that came up is a question I've actually had with one of my associations, is an African-American, in this particular question that was asked here, it was an Asian claiming I want to live in a community with other Asians. In the case that we had in another area, the Fair Housing Council sent out testers, and they were African American, and they would go around to the different real estate offices, and they would, among other things, they would talk about pools, and they would talk about this and things that were basically pretty objectively verifiable. But then they'd say, and we want our son to grow up in a Black community. What can you tell me? And so now, I guess, Matt, I'll first start with you, is people do ask those questions. And I have a really good friend. He happens to be the attorney for the multiple listing service, and he's also a broker. And he says, look, we can have all these rules and we can talk about, but the reality is clients expect you to answer questions. Some questions just should not be answerable. What do you think?
Well, so the issue, of course, the baggage that I covered is our industry has this demonstrated for a variety of reasons of you can't introduce levels of discrimination that potentially deprive somebody of the roof over their head. I mean, we are trading in a basic human need on the housing side of the real estate industry. And so clearly you'll have the questions are not invalid. It's just we as real estate licensees, we as realtors can't be the ones that are dispensing the information. And so common alternative sources would be, you can find census tract information. You can find school district and campus by campus information. So if you want your kid going to a school that is either this idealized tapestry of diversity or specifically seeking out one that is overwhelmingly Black, there are plenty of resources for the consumer who actually wants that information to find it. And I'll just tell you, when I'm in those conversations, mindful of the fact that at some point you don't want your client throttling you and saying, well, then why am I working with you if you can't answer questions that seem pretty within bounds to me? And I'll usually explain, there are a variety of fair housing related restrictions that my industry has earned over, a really sad history. And I need to be very circumspect in these areas because I can't make it look like you were being steered to or from on the basis of your membership in a protected class or other people in the areas that we're looking at. So I'm not doing it to be evasive. I'm doing it because I have a whole bunch of legal restrictions. But let's talk about other resources that may be of use to you that will help you accomplish the specific objective that the line of questioning is aimed at.
And one of the resources, and we'll end with this because the clock on the wall says we have to, is the love letters. I know that NAR has an extreme caution. I've talked to Katie about it. We've had many conversations. I know that CAR actually in their new listing agreement, which comes out today, has revised the section that specifically talks about talking to your seller about why you don't want to get these love letters. And of course, lawyers like me are constantly standing on our platforms and telling them that, look, there can be no good that can come of this, particularly if there's something that even is innocuous. And let me give you one that was absolutely appeared on its face to be not harmful. There were 18 offers over a 2-day period, which sounded like a lot at the time. Today, that doesn't sound so much, right? There are 18 offers on a house over a 2-day period. And many of the houses, and all now becoming above list price, all good for the seller. And there were letters being written. One of the letters, which appealed to the seller's emotion, was, I have friends in the neighborhood. I really like to visit the neighborhood. The only thing, and I went on and on about how much I want to be part of this neighborhood. And the only thing she actually didn't say, and I also happen to be white like the rest of the neighborhood. So even where it's at least ostensibly not prejudiced or biased, there are going to be those situations. I tell my broker clients, stay away from them. And in the new listing agreement, just so people know, by the way, there's a newsletter coming out for y'all coming up in the next couple of days, is have that conversation with your sellers and then stay out of it if you can as the realtor, but encourage them to be very, very cautious about the love letters. What say you, Molly, in terms of the implicit nature of these? And then I'll end with both Brandon and Matt, and then we'll sign off.
I'm laughing because my family wrote a love letter just a few years ago, having no awareness of the possible implicit bias implications. So this is great. I think that's it. I think sometimes we don't know what we don't know. I was in the consumer role in that instance when we asked, can we write a letter? We really want this home speaks to us, all this stuff. And I think that, that you've already nailed it on the head. Like we need to be very cautious and kind of look at all of these practices with that critical eye and that additional layering of education that you all are here today to do, right? So congratulations, you've just done that for the last 2 hours of your busy schedules by being here and maybe becoming aware or being reminded of things that we just got to look out for.
Brandon, and then we'll end with Matt, and then we'll say thank you and goodbye.
Yeah, I'll just say with the letters, remember that when we talk about the theory of discrimination, of discriminatory effects or impact, that, we don't want to perpetuate segregation, right? And so it's not necessarily the intent or whether it was unconscious or this. I mean, I go back to when I look at love letters, I'm not taking an official position, but like, what's the justification? Why are we doing it? Like, what interest does it serve? I thought the interest was, let's make as much money as we can on the sale. Is that the identified business interest? And when we start changing that, and well, it's something else, and then again, we start going the extra mile for someone, this is the concern with the letter. I'm not saying in and of itself it's a violation, but I'm saying it could bring on intentional discrimination. And certainly if one were to study it and have data, you'd wonder what the outcome was of when those letters were used and who was the, especially if like a certain brokerage house had that policy. We always want a letter. And then we go back and look at the data and it's like, well, look, it was always, 85% of the time a person who's Caucasian who gets the home. So I'm not saying it's a problem, but that it's a violation in and of itself. But I think there's enough issues here where you want to be working with your counsel, you want to be working with an association for guidance, because it is a very hot market, as you said. It's extreme right now. And these are going to be some of the factors that come up. And the person who doesn't get the home is going to be wondering why. And I know there's issues around, do we have to disclose all the offers? And you're going to say, why didn't I get? I heard so-and-so, he took a lower offer. And then you're going to say, oh, but our letter showed blank. And I'm not saying that's going to be the reason, but it adds that weight in there versus a standardized procedure. This is how we select. How fast can we close? How much is the offer? Versus some kind of intangible thing. So, I recognize the energy there, that it's people are desperate. So, but I do think we need to have caution. But so I would say that, and I'll pass it to you, Matt. Very interested in your insight.
Yeah, so what Molly said, it was great that she put on her consumer hat, given that she's here to talk about implicit bias and not recurring to her. It's our job as licensees. We're the ones that know about that minefield. It's not Molly's job when she's wearing her consumer hat to know it. It may be her job now, but it wasn't her job wearing an a very typical emotionally charged consumer of owner-occupied housing hat. That's my job to know that's a minefield, not the consumer's fault. Therefore, California, now I'm going to tell you, we here in the Midwest often look askance at some of the crazy stuff California does. I think what you were doing with your statewide forms is brilliant. We're saying across the board, the default position is, no, this listing agreement serves as written direction. There will be no love letters. You have to affirmatively opt in and say that you're doing it against the advice of counsel and your clergy and God himself, and only then am I going to opt in and say I'm going to transmit love letters. But otherwise, the default setting is we're not doing it because it is a minefield. And my last comment on that is, as a pro standards guy, never underestimate the cost and inconvenience of somebody filing a complaint, not because they know that there was a discrimination, an act of discrimination, but doing it for purposes of discovery. I'm not certain that I was discriminated against or not, but I sure don't understand why I lost that house. And I'm going to file a complaint just for purposes of discovery. I do not want to be on the receiving end of one of those just because we had love letters going back and forth when we could have just gotten the seller's written direction. This is a minefield. We are respectfully asking you to give us written direction, not to take you into.
I had dinner with my realtor in Franklin, Tennessee the other night. She and her husband invited us over. And we were talking about the love letters, and she said, and I'm going to try and do the accent, but it'll be awful. Well, I don't allow them, I don't accept them, and I won't let my buyers do them. Period. Just stay away from them. They really don't. Because there's so much going on right now. When you have NAR telling you not to do it, when you have CAR in writing telling you not to do it in their fair housing advisory, when you have people like all of us telling you not to do it, what's the standard of care going to be in that industry? You have a duty to not discriminate. We all know that. All of a sudden, something comes up in these love letters that even inadvertently creates an issue. The standard of care is not going to be your friend. And so there are better other ways of doing what you want to do. And again, I just think that's the best practice. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am so grateful that you agreed to join us today. I know my membership got a lot out of it. I know that we had an awful lot of people sign up, so I suspect that the recording of this is going to be in the thousands. I mean, we've had that number come up a lot, so I really appreciate it. As always, Brandon, thank you. I'll look forward to speaking with you again, Matt. I'll keep an eye out for the programs you're on, and Molly, just thank you so much, and I just appreciate all of you so much in terms of helping my associations. Laura and Lori, thank you so much for the work that you did in putting all this together. And with that, I'm going to say, be good out there, and we'll see you the next time. So thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.